Hello, friends. It is Monday of Holy Week, and let us continue Holy Week as Kurt started us off yesterday with Palm Sunday. Let's continue with the lectionary reading for Monday of Holy Week, and if you would like to follow along with me, I am reading from John chapter 12, verses 1 to 11, and after this, I'll share with you a reflection. A woman anoints Jesus with perfume. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she would save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. Here ends the reading. The lectionary reading for Monday of Holy Week unearthed a memory for me from my seminary days, and I'd apologize because I can't remember all of the details. And if anyone from my time at the Atlantic School of Theology happens to be watching this and remembers this completely differently, by all means, let me know. However, the questions that were raised from my memory of this event are what are really the main issue here. Here's the gist. One of the graduating classes, and it very well may have been my own, wanted to give a gift to the school that had molded us, that had formed us, and shaped us into the little rookie ministers that we were about to become. Now, on a side note, I'd also like to throw it out there that AST was an ecumenical school. So although there were certain denominationally based courses, like worship and sacraments, the school was predominantly made up of United and Anglican students, with some Roman Catholic lay people, and we had some other denominations mixed throughout too. We had a few Salvation Army, I remember one Church of the Nazarene, so we were this beautiful, diverse mix of different Christian traditions. A blessing of attending an ecumenical seminary is being taught and being formed in the presence of other traditions. So we also got to learn and experience the similarities as well as the differences between us. And at the same time, this exact thing was also a challenge, particularly when these denominational differences are front and center in the decision-making process. Again, my deepest apologies for not being able to remember the exact details around this. However, when it was time to decide what the gift would be, although there was a clear consensus that it ought to be something specifically given for the chapel, strong opinions were held that were clearly divided between denominational lines. Generally, there was a consensus about donating a jug and a plate and a cup that could be used, regardless of who was worshiping, for communion. Many of the social justice-oriented students of one particular denomination would have been perfectly happy with something very plain, very inexpensive, and to give a donation to a local charitable organization that was particularly in need in the school's name, where the money could do something really, really wonderful for some people. Many of the other students of another denomination believed if we were to give a gift of a chalice and a plate to show our deep appreciation for the school, for its professors, that we ought to use all of the money that had been offered, that all of the other students had chipped in, to do so, and to do so with a beautiful plate and chalice and jug, using up all of the money that had been offered, because whatever happened to offering our very best to God. And isn't that just the question? Do we only give in a way that has the most impact for the most people? Is there a place for luxurious gifts, even though few might benefit from the offering? Now, isn't that just central to the story today? And to be fair, people tend to have naturally very strong opinions about Judas. And the writer of John's Gospel in particular is very hard on Judas. He even makes a point of putting in there, now Judas was not saying this because he cared about the poor, but because, etc., etc. And so let's just name that bias up front in this telling of the story, that the writer of John's Gospel is also very, very biased against Judas. But I can't help but wonder, in this case, to some extent, didn't Judas have a point? The writer of John's Gospel, of course, portrays him as being a huge jerk about it. But underneath that, wasn't he kind of right? Over and over again, Scripture makes reference to us being humble, reinforcing that we are called to be good and faithful stewards and servants of creation, giving all that we have, remembering the poor and the widow and the orphan among us. But here we have Mary of Bethany owning this ridiculously expensive perfume. We are told the value of a year's wage, breaking it in her hands as Jesus broke bread, pouring it abundantly as Jesus poured wine. So what are we to make of this? I read this in a few different ways, which usually leads me to more questions and fewer answers, but what are you gonna do? A few reflections and a few questions. Maybe a lesson from this story is that maybe it's about serving those who are on our doorstep. In the story, Jesus says that really uncomfortable phrase, "You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." I, for one, choose to believe that we actually can eradicate poverty. I choose to believe that someday, in some way, communities and cities, provinces and nations will make the choice to work together to figure this out. But I digress. Maybe here, what's being said is, this is an ongoing reality. In the meantime, I'm here now. Maybe a message for us here is that, yes, there is absolutely an aching world out there, but sometimes there is a need to help the person who is right in front of us. That might be our calling in the moment. My other wondering is, what if the real problem here is not the morality of whether or not Mary should have sold the perfume and given the money to the poor? Maybe it's not about the morality of selling the perfume versus offering it to anoint Jesus with it. What if the real issue here is the judgment of another's offering? The shaming of one who gave a luxurious gift with the most loving of hearts. I'm reminded of the story of Cain and Abel that we explored some months ago in the not too far distant past, where the two brothers each offered what they had. One offered meat, one offered grain of their flock, of their crops, and only one of them was accepted, with no real explanation given except for the fact that we know Cain throws a temper tantrum with some pretty disastrous consequences. So it's kind of implied here that the problem is not what Cain is offering. The problem is the heart of the giver. So maybe when we look at this story, the question is not about luxury versus what can do the most good for the most people all the time. Maybe it's about not shaming another's offering when it's given with a cheerful and loving heart. My last wondering about this, and this one might not be directly relatable, but maybe a little relatable. Jesus in this story knows his impending fate. He knows this. He says, "You will not always have me." And here Mary offers him the gift of touch, of intimacy, of comfort. How many of us now, in our current world situation, are deeply missing that connectedness, the physical connectedness with those we know and love, that maybe we've taken for granted? How quickly we have all been met with the reminder that at the end of the day, no matter how introverted or extroverted we might be, that when it comes to our friends and our family and our community of faith, that physical closeness, healthy consenting touch, those hugs, holding hands, passing the peace, being together with those we hold in our hearts the closest, that is what we are missing the absolute most. And speaking of today's circumstances, maybe we can take it a step even further. Maybe it was the impractical nature of Mary's gift itself that was Judas's issue. So many of us prioritize practical things above the rest. Just think of arguments when it comes to government, various levels, and their funding. How many argue for government funding towards more practical things, for example, over and above the arts? And now here we are, locked in our homes, separated from one another, and longing for relationship and connection. Where have we turned to? We've turned to the arts. It's the books and the puzzles and the painting, the coloring, the music, television, film. This is where our hearts turn to in the absence of more human connection, for comfort, for distraction, and a sense of connection. So friends, as we spend Holy Week rather differently this year, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on today's story, since I shared with you my wonderings and my thoughts about it. So please feel free to share via email or Facebook message, or better yet, write in a comment on our Facebook page where we can have this conversation together in online faith community. For those of you who are wondering, I believe what we settled on was a cup and a chalice that was a little expensive, but it was also made by a local potter. So we somehow managed to meet in the middle, even with our differences. So friends, sleep well, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.